Welcome to SikhCast, brought to you by Sikh Research Institute, illuminating every path.
This episode of the SikhCast is from a live webinar that originally aired on July 21st, 2021.
Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Thank you for joining today's webinar hosted by the Sikh Research Institute. This webinar will begin with a 40-minute moderated discussion between our panelists today, after which we will have 20 minutes of Q&A from the audience. So please drop your questions in the chat box and be sure to include your name and city. I'd like to start today off by introducing our presenters. We have Harinder Singh, who serves as the Senior Fellow Research and Policy at the Sikh Research Institute. He's a widely respected educator and thinker who's deeply in love with one force, the oneness that radiates in all. He co-founded the Sikh Research Institute and the Punjab Digital Library, organized the Free Akal Takht movement, and envisioned Kaur and Singh Academy. His current focus is on availing the message of the Guru Granth Sahib to global populations and developing critical thinking in Sikh institutions. He currently resides in the United States with his wife and 2 children. Jasleen Kaur is a double UVA grad in religious studies, focusing on South Asian religions through the lens of literature and poetry. She's currently working as a researcher with SikhRI. She is passionate about projects that create comfortable spaces for community members of all ages and backgrounds to engage in dialogue and learn from one another. She hopes to eventually go back to school to pursue a PhD in either religious ethnography or history and fulfill her dream of teaching and learning from others. So today's conversation will be focused on the 7th State of the Month report titled Miri-Piri, the Political Spiritual Sikh Doctrine. This is kind of building off of a conversation that we had last year around Miri-Piri, actually exactly 1 year from today. So we're thinking about how that conversation is shifting and focus even within just the context of that 1 year. This report is being released today on Miri-Piri Day. So before we get into talking about what the report says about Miri-Piri, I'd love it, Jasleen Kaur, if you could start off by sharing why Miri-Piri was chosen as the focus for this report and situating it, I guess, within the larger context of what State of the Month actually is.
Yeah, good morning and fateh everyone. So before I get into why, we started doing the State of the Month series a few years ago, and it's a series of reports focusing on Sikh matters. So we survey the general population, we ask them questions related to a topic to get a sense of where we're all at, how we all understand a certain thing, maybe what we think about a certain thing, and then we frame that survey within a larger report exploring a subject. So we've done reports on abortion, sexuality, Akal Takht Sahib, who is a Sikh, and when we were talking about what to do next, it was a year ago and maybe a little over a year ago, and at least in the US, it was primary election season, and we were thinking a lot about just politics and political engagement. I think a lot of Sikhs in just kind of the public discourse, we're talking about this. And we live in a time where we're all much more sort of politically engaged, partially because we have to be. We have a lot more access to information about what's going on politically, no matter where we live. And so then the question comes up of like, how do I assert my understanding of Miri-Piri doctrine? How do I understand that and our ideas of sovereignty, and also exist as a human being who's like a citizen under like a modern nation state? Like, how do I combine those things and understand those things in their relationships to one another? So those were large questions that we were having. We were also seeing outside of kind of just like the area of like elections and voting, we were seeing the farmers' protest beginning and how so many people are able to assert that doctrine outside of just like voting and outside of just that kind of what we maybe consider like classical political engagement. and there we saw organizing, mass organizing. So we were thinking of all these questions, and that's why we kind of settled on this, because it's a thing that I think a lot of us are curious about and maybe don't fully understand, the Miri-Piri doctrine. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. Harinder Singh, was there anything that you wanted to add?
Sure, Manvinder. Guru Fateh, everyone, and greetings of the day. In addition to what Jasleen said, this is a conversation which is always taking place, but mostly when Sikhs, especially in the quote-unquote Panthic circles, invoke Miri-Piri, they really keep it at a very historical and ideal levels. They're really not wrestling with it, if I may use that word, to figure out what to do with it in our contemporary realities, just like what Guru Nanak did with it, or what Guru Hargobind Pasha did with it. Every Guru who not only just talked about the doctrine, because that's the awareness generation, that's the imparting of the ideas on how to live as a Sikh, but they're actually being active in both spiritual, political arenas. So, we usually think of this as being some ideal, which it is, but it's very much a doctrine, and that's why we named it as such. It needs to be interpreted by all generations, just like in 18th century, Sikhs did it in post-Guru period, and last 100 years ago, and throughout the 100 years they were doing it. We need to be doing it today. And not only during American elections or Indian elections or SGPC elections or Punjab elections or now DSGMC elections or your Gurdwara elections. This is really a question of policies. How do we make the Sikh way of life based on Ikku Ankar and Naam implementable in a way which are affecting this sort of looting, as if I may call Guru Nanak, to pick the Guru Nanak Sahib's word, this looting by only the spiritual and only by the political. So this wrestling is required today. It's required every day. In Atlanta, Georgia, they're discussing how to fight voter suppression. In India, they're discussing why is the DSGMC head, the current president, in Hazur Sahib, and what is Akal Takht Acting Jathedar going to do about that, because they are manipulating the next elections because of the corruption charges. So this is very much on our faces everywhere in the world, not just where the larger Sikh diasporas are. And we really need to understand what really is Miri-Piri, how it has been practiced and understood over the generations, and how can we actually wrestle with it in order to make the realities of our communities better.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's something in the report that touches upon thinking about how you can push the center without specifically always focusing on politicians, or what we would consider what we would associate commonly with the political as politicians. So pushing the center without focusing on the center. But that's something we can talk about later on in our conversation. You kind of already touched upon it, Harinder Singh, but Jasleen Kaur, I'm wondering if you can share some of the common misconceptions about Miri-Piri doctrine that were tackled both within the report, and I guess that would be influenced by what you had seen in the survey results. Yeah, I'm really curious to see or to hear about what the Bunth was saying about Miri-Piri.
Yeah, so I think one of the most common misconceptions about Miri-Piri is that it started with Guru Hargobind Sahib. So that Guru Nanak Sahib was just a Piri Guru. And that Miri didn't enter until Guru Hargobind Sahib. And I think that's rooted in maybe how we understand Miri-Piri as just being about sort of organizing militarily and sort of narrowing what we define as a political thing. And so part of what we did in the report was through the framing of Jagjit Singh's three sort of goals of the Sikh revolution, we took that framing and we traced Miri-Piri from Guru Nanak Sahib all the way to Guru Gobind Singh Sahib and beyond. And we explored things what is a deeply political thing that Guru Nanak Sahib did? Bearing witness to the atrocities of Babur is a political act. Writing about that is a political act. Establishing langar and just upending systems merely with your words, building a following where systems are being threatened, hegemonies are being threatened, that is a political act. Guru Angad Sahib codifying Gurmat to accommodate many languages to increase accessibility, where before the priestly class was the only group that had accessibility to certain things, to certain spiritualities, right? Like these are all political things. The establishment of cities, centralizing power, establishing trade, all of that is political, and it all was happening starting with Guru Nanak Sahib and continuing through the Guru period and beyond. So I think that's a large misconception, and it's really rooted in how we define what is political. And I think another thing that we saw in the survey was also just like the belief that like when it comes to Miri-Piri, one has to take precedence over the other instead of them being in this kind of constant relationship and dialogue with one another. And so I think that was really common. Something that was interesting is that like there was one like sort of gender split based on how people identify, where people who identify as women were saying that actually the religious should not take precedence over the political, and actually the political and the religious should be kept separate. Not in a majority, but it was just more split where women were responding that way, or they were saying the religious should not take precedence over the political. And so part of what that kind of raised for us, knowing that the majority of our respondents were from North America, is like how much that sort of doctrine of like separation of church and state that we see in like the West is very much in like Sikh psyches, at least in a lot of diaspora countries. And then also like how a lot of times that relationship between the religious and the political, as we might understand it, let's say in like North America, is a lot of times about like policing women's bodies. And so it made sense to us that there was that split. But I think that misconception is rooted in like equating Miri-Piri with like the combination of what we call church and state in this country and in other countries in the kind of quote unquote West. So yeah, those were large ones. I actually, I did find it surprising that like 80% of respondents did say like it is possible to assert Miri-Piri doctrine while you're a citizen under a different nation state. I think that was like surprising to me, but that is something that we explore in the report. So there were some things that I expected to go one way and didn't, and some things that I was not expecting when it came to the survey, and sort of misconceptions that we've seen through that.
Mm-hmm. I guess a follow-up question I have is, was there a particular spot within the survey that you saw participants disengaging, or they weren't answering as fully? I'm wondering if you saw that.
I think what tends to happen with most of our surveys is that when it comes to like longer answers where we're asking for sort of input on like solutions, people tend to disengage there because we don't always have solutions, or we don't always have recommendations as individuals. I think that just shows the need for deeper explorations of these things. I will say that there is a section in the report where we asked about these imperfect systems, which Harinder Singh had mentioned, but we ask about like how people engage knowing that the systems are imperfect. And if we want to talk about like disengagement, not within the survey, but like politically, something that was really interesting is that like 53% of participants actually said, I abstain from political systems, but I engage in these other ways, whether that's like grassroots organizing, or any kind of like activism. And so it's interesting that the majority of the respondents actually said, like, I understand that these systems are imperfect, and so I'm finding ways outside of those systems to make some kind of change in society, some kind of change in what I see in my country's policies, like things like that. I think that that's really interesting, and kind of points to what I was talking about before, where like we're in a time where everything is being uncovered because we have all this access to information about what's not working. And I think, I know everybody says this, and it's been over a year of a pandemic, but that really uncovered a lot of things about what doesn't work. Not just in America, in literally every country. So I think that's something that I am kind of encouraged by, is that people aren't just giving up. They're finding new ways to engage.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's nice to hear. I think, something that stood out from your answer was, I guess the previous answer was like this constant dialogue between Miri-Piri. I actually had to like grab my notebook very subtly to write it down, because I think that's a great way of thinking about it. So I'm wondering, Harinder Singh, if we want to delve a little bit more into the actual report, what does Bani say about Miri-Piri? How is it invoked in Bani? Is it invoked at all? I'm wondering if there's similar phrases or terms used in Bani.
Sure. So, to continue from the last segment of the question, which Jasleen was beautifully answering, we've always been engaging with imperfect system, including the gurus. So when Guru Nanak is engaged with an imperfect system under the Mughal Empire at the time, and eventually, the Sikhs under the British and the Indian, and now several nation states, what does Guru Nanak do? So what is first thing we need to really understand is that in Guru Granth Sahib, it is very clear that Guru Nanak was starting a new form of Raj. And that's very, very clear in Guru Granth Sahib when it says, Nanak Raj Chalaya, Sach Kot Satani Neev De. Guru Nanak did start a Raj, which means at minimum, he was tackling the systems and the policies. That's what we call them today. That's at minimum what Raj is. And when it goes all the way, which means it's not just about reforming and introducing new policies and systems. Now we think system is so corrupt, we're going to actually turn it around and have a revolution, including a political one, to create a alternative form of Raj. So all this is what we see in 550 years of history, and Guru Nanak started there. And if Guru Nanak started there, he very clearly, when the Patta de Savaye, historicity of Guru Nanak is being presented by them, they say it very clearly that Guru Nanak enjoyed what? Raj Jog Manyo, Basyo Nirvair Redantar. That with the fearless, incessantly residing in Guru Nanak's heart, Guru Nanak enjoyed the Raj and the Jog. This is what we call in the West, we are caught up in this church and state, and Raj and Jog is actually a little bit different than that. The Jog idea has to do with spirituality, the connection. It's not yoga. It's about when you are connected with the force of the word, the Ekuankar of the word. And Raj is when you are being politically active in order to implement that idea of Ekuankar through your connection. And what it's saying is Guru Nanak enjoyed the spiritual and the political angle. If I flip it from a Western angle, just to contextualize a little bit more, the West is debating whether there's a separation between church and state. But even within West, there is no denying that there is always the religious and the political. They actually work together, sometimes separately, sometimes together, to come up with many policy doctrines throughout the world, including how they get implemented, including in Western democracy, not just in monarchical system or other systems throughout history. So Guru Nanak Sahib actually utilizes the word Miri-Piri himself. When he says, in the context of Babar's attack, he says, Koti hu Pir varj raha hai, jab Mir sunayat aaya. So Mir and Pir. Mir comes from Amir, which essentially means that somebody who's a head of political unit, sometimes called prince. Now we call them by different ministerships, whether it's prime or whether it's president or heads of state of different kinds. And the Pir comes, Piri and Pir, it's related to the spirituality, somebody who claims to be the head of some spirituality or religious orders. And he says, where were all the spirituals when the political attacked the South Asia? So he utilizes those words, and there are many more. The word Pir and Mir, when it's presented in Guru Granth Sahib, because Guru Nanak is dealing with this imperfect system, he lists as another place where he says, Pest Pir lavj kamai andaja. So he says, just the Pirs are worried about this heavenly ideas. And then he says, what are the Mirs up to? He says, the Mir Malak Umre Fanaya. Essentially, that there are two different domains and people had defined their boundaries. That's what Guru Sahib was dealing with. And he countered that with this idea of Raj Jog, this idea of bringing Miri-Piri together, this idea of what now the popular Sikh world calls Bhakti Shakti together. Although the same words don't come in Guru Granth Sahib, but the idea of Sir Sakt comes in Guru Granth Sahib very clearly. The idea of Bingur Bhagat, the word Bhakti comes, the devotion comes very clearly. Essentially, what I'm trying to say is, in Guru Granth Sahib, it is so clear that our job here is to, while we are connecting with the Ekuankar, the force, the all-pervasive, the light, the Har in this world, At the same time, we use that connection to change the realities of the communities we live in, whether they're economic policies, political, and everything in between.
Mm-hmm. I hear you kind of already doing it. I'm thinking about I think you're already doing like the contextualizing of of Miri-Piri and how it changes and how various people under various leaders have understood it. I'm also hearing like what would be like kind of separating it from our current understanding of church and state. So a real like contemporary contextualizing as well. So what I'm kind of getting at is the history section of the report where both of you or everyone that was involved in the report is really trying to trace Miri-Piri from Guru Nanak Sahib to Guru Gobind Singh Sahib and through several periods of history. So of course, a total of over 550 years. I'm wondering how were understandings of Miri-Piri changing and being influenced by the context? I know you've already touched upon a little bit of, both of you have touched upon the contemporary kind of, thinking about how it's different from what we understand as secularism or the separation of church and state. So I'm wondering, how has history influenced changing understandings and practices of Miri-Piri, particularly, I guess I'm thinking about post-Guru period. Harinder Singh, that question is for you.
Okay, sure. I can start and Jasleen can take over at some point. So look, one thing is very clear, that Miri-Piri as an institution got developed from Guru Nanak through Guru Gobind Singh Maharaj period. So there is already a 239 years of training going on there. Now, when we see it, when the Manvinder Singh Bahadur is sent to Punjab to practice elements of that, we see it. Like he, in Sikh context, I mean, how he's carrying Miri-Piri with him. How is he doing it? Well, he becomes of the Guru. We have a ceremony for that, Khande Bade Ki Paul, or initiation ceremony, Amrit popularly. He's given the royal symbols, 5 arrows and the 5 to consult with in order to create policies, and he becomes the implementer. So the Miri-Piri comes into play as to how he captures the Raj in Punjab and how he becomes the administrator there, how he releases the coins and the seals, how he appoints the administrative heads and the political heads, how he does not disturb even the Naqshbandi orders, religious places, because we don't do that. Even if somebody has been responsible for making the legal cases for assassinations or what we call martyrdoms of Guru Arjan Sahib, Guru Tegh Bahadur Sahib, Chote Sahibzades, all of that. Banda Singh Bahadur did it. So essentially every period, if you look at from Baba Banda till Maharaja Ranjit Singh period until 1849, 18th century is a great example of how Miri-Piri every generation wrestled with, and they came up with their solution in the realities they lived in. In fact, it's beautifully captured in one of the compositions by Bhai Gurdas Singh. He wrote something called Ramkali Var Padshahi Daswin Ki. And I really like this composition because it's dated around 1783, I think. But in there, he invokes, he says, what has happened? So this is the 18th century period. He says, Mir Pir Sab Chhap Gaye, Mazbo Ultana. That the spiritual and the political have eloped, or they're hiding actually. And Mazhab, the organized religion, has gone crazy, which means upside down, Ultana. Essentially, he's saying this is the reality the Khalsa was dealing with. And in this reality, then Khalsa became organized. He calls Khalsa the third Mazhab, the third organized religion, the alternative to the 2 organized religions, because Khalsa is organized. In order to implement Miri-Piri, you have to be very organized. Any movement will tell you to bring any policy changes, you have to be organized. So 18th century Sikhs did it in various ways. Dal Khalsa did it in their way. Misal period did it this way. They survived the 2 major Lukaras. They survived multiple genocidal campaigns. They declared the Sikh Raj when capturing Lahore in 1765. So Miri-Piri is evolving. Miri-Piri is being practiced. The definitions are not getting changed. The meaning of Miri-Piri is not changing. But after 1849, if I may just stop at this second, just mention this much and then stop, that after 1849, we see how Miri-Piri is being used by a state now, especially the British Empire. And then in 47, how the definitions of Miri-Piri are being changed. So for the first 150 years after the Guru period, Sikhs understood the institution, the doctrine, and they implemented it in their best capacities, including by organizing the Khalsa. After the advent of British Empire and within the Indian state, both the appropriation of Miri-Piri started, and there has been a concerted effort to change the understanding of Miri-Piri and redefine it in last 70 years within the Indian state as well.
Jasleen Kaur, I'm wondering if you want to talk a little bit about that appropriation and how the state has been actively shifting this definition and our understandings of Miri-Piri.
Yeah, I think something that we had talked about in kind of the British period with the Crown is the way that they kind of, sort of twisted understanding of Miri-Piri doctrine to serve the state. And so it became very much about pacifying us by kind of like providing Guru Granth Sahibs to certain Sikh regiments, or kind of allowing Sikhs to keep their external identifiers and sort of their practices, but kind of divorcing our understanding of what it means to be embodying that doctrine from, like divorcing the spiritual from the political, so that our understanding of Miri-Piri became that because we are sovereign, or because we have this sort of element of a principle that's sort of left, then that means that our defense of the state is somehow honoring Miri-Piri. And I think that is something that we still see. Like, there's still Sikhs who, and I don't want to get too into it because we all have our opinions on this, but there are still Sikhs who say like, oh, well, if I serve like as a police officer, or if I serve as a soldier, that's me practicing Miri-Piri. And again, don't want to get too far into that argument, but like a lot of that understanding, I think, is rooted in that switch that happens in a sort of secularization of Miri-Piri, if I can say that, where it's not about honoring that doctrine through like service to people and the core sort of like principles that we understand of oneness, right? Like, it's about serving a power, or serving as an extension of a power. And when we talk about like sovereignty, our idea of sovereignty is only rooted in the eternal. It's rooted in a Kalpurik. It's not about place or state or time. And so I think that question of like how we understand Miri-Piri, and by extension, how we understand what it means to say like, I'm Sikh and therefore I understand myself as sovereign. Like, what does that actually mean? I think that like we see what was done during this period where the British had like kind of reappropriated Miri-Piri doctrine, and we see its effects still today. And so that's one big thing. I think we had also talked about just like revolutionaries who embodied Miri-Piri kind of in its form as we understand it to be from the Guru period, were a huge threat to the British. And we're jailed, and we're seen as enemies of the state. And these are people that we kind of always think of. I mean, we talked about Manvinder Singh. We think about Manvinder Singh as this kind of like quiet man who like wrote a lot of poetry and beautiful words, but he wasn't. That's not all he did. And there are these people who understood what it meant to assert that doctrine, not just in their writing, but in their like organization of the people, in educating people, in mobilizing people. And that is so threatening to the state. And we see that even now in India, where like if you embody Miri-Piri doctrine, the term terrorist gets thrown around quite a lot. And so, we're seeing that still. And I think that revisiting the Guru period and revisiting, primary and secondary sources as we understand or try to better understand Miri-Piri will help us kind of recenter and unlearn some of that sort of shifting in understanding, if that makes sense.
I think it makes complete sense. I think it's really like what I'm understanding from what you're sharing is like a dilution of what Miri-Piri is to serve like colonial means or to serve the nation state, which of course makes sense. Like you shared that would be something that would serve like colonial states and perhaps contemporary like nation states well, to kind of suppress a doctrine that could like liberate or go against like the wants of the state. So I think, to me, that's a very important facet of both colonialism and the contemporary nation state. But I don't want to ramble too much about that. Kind of bringing it into the contemporary, because I could ramble forever, but bringing it into the contemporary, things have changed. I think that's kind of where we're headed to within our conversation. We as in Sikhs are living under many nation states. So how are we currently practicing Miri-Piri under these nation states? So I guess more of those like action items that folks, I guess, were struggling with on the survey. Particularly, I'm referring here, I guess, to the Rahit section, where you're exploring varying questions related to Miri-Piri application in different nation states, what that looks like, what that has looked like, perhaps what it could look like. But my question is, how have we and how can we practice Miri-Piri in these varying contexts? Harinder Singh, perhaps you could start us off.
Sure. So let me again start from early 20th century, right? So what Jasleen was describing, I at the same time want to mention that even gurus were creating alliances in the imperfect systems. That doesn't mean that we do not understand the doctrine fully, and even when state is trying to overpower the doctrine or redefine it. So for example, in late 19th and early 20th century, even when Sikhs are dealing with Crown, they know what's going on, and the Crown knows that Khalsa is not going to completely accept them. At some point, they're going to revolt. So some thought our way of practicing in this imperfect system is to join them and then fight for Sikh sovereignty in Punjab. Others thought, let's join their adversaries, by joining the Japanese and the Germans through the Indian National Army, which was founded by General Mohan Singh. And that's how they were trying to fight it. And there were others who were independents, like Babbar Akalis. So yes, Manvinder Singh and Harinder Singh were creating education disruption, even within the colonial system. At the other side, there were the militant wings, like the Babbar Akalis, who were the predecessors to the left movements, the Bhagat Singhs and the Kartar Singh Sarabhas of the time. And they were all practicing Miri-Piri in imperfect systems as they best understood. The reason I'm bringing this back again is, but at the time, the Sikh groups didn't say that they are sellouts. And this is very important to understand. If somebody is working with the system, knowing it's an imperfect system, like we do it today too, that doesn't mean that they don't understand Miri-Piri. There might be cases of those, but they're thinking this is all they can do at this given moment because they do not have complete geographical, or what we now call nation state sovereignty. So in 20th century and now in 21st, what we are dealing with is, where we have not elected officials, we are struggling to do that in America, for example. And we think by becoming part of the system here, whether it's armed forces, whether it's polices, whether it's attorney generals, whether it's mayors, whether it is winning local elections, mayoral elections, or state senators, state reps, eventually maybe we can get to what Dalip Singh Saun had done, 50 years ago. That's an aspiration. It's a wrestling. This is the wrestling going on. So if certain Sikhs feel this is not the way to do it, they should create more alternatives. But in the countries like Canada, where they have achieved up to 19 positions, even at a federal level, and ministership levels and cabinet levels, the question we are raising, and we need to raise much more, that especially if they are initiated Sikhs, can they really serve the state as well as the Panth? How will they do that when they come to conflict with their political party, or when there's a conflict with the charter, for example, in Canada? We are facing that. In countries like Canada, the questions we are trying to raise are, well, now they have made it to, although there are less MPs, but there are also lordships, there are many OBEs, civil servants, armed forces, everywhere Sikhs have made it. But when the question comes up, for example, in ethnic coding, can they start to develop consensus before they make their public positions, even after they have made public positions? How do Sikhs and asserting Miri-Piri create consensus where there is a varying approach, even within the Sikh fold, but it is centered around the state? In that case, UK's ethnic coding laws. And lastly, and not least, India, we have SGPC elections, we have Gurdwara politics going on, and DSGMC. We have Punjab elections coming up. Everyone's wondering, well, if Navjot Sidhu, for example, can quote very nicely from Gurbani and can invoke Banda Singh Bahadur and other people, including Guru Gobind Singh Maharaj, can he actually deliver something for Sikhs in Punjab if he becomes a CM or as an MP or if he becomes a minister? Because we are seeing this in India quite a bit. Sikhs have served in all political parties there, all major political parties. They have been heads of states in terms of prime ministership and presidentship. They have been heads of army. They have been heads of minority commissions, planning commissions. They have been CMs. But we still have not delivered more for Punjab and for Sikhi. We are still getting defined by the upper house of parliament as to who even a Sikh is. The National Security Advisor of India, G. Doval, is on record saying that we will be defining the Miri-Piri of the Sikhs now. This is the situation we are caught up in. We need to understand how definitions are being changed in certain spaces and how Miri-Piri is not a monolith when it comes to creating some tough choices. But in order to create that choice, in order to even have 3-4 different ways of practicing, we must understand at the highest level of Miri-Piri, and the doctrine itself actually demands that each individual, each Sikh, is sovereign. And we only answer to Akal Purkh as a sovereign, and the nation states will come and go. We will fight the nation states when they are regressive, when they violate the Eko and Naam principles, and we will join them in creating alliances when we are fighting a larger adversary who's violating them at a larger levels.
Jasleen Kaur, I'm wondering if there's anything that you wanted to add around understandings of how Miri-Piri is contemporarily practiced.
Yeah, I'll say I've definitely revealed myself to be sort of still trying to understand that point that Harinder made, which is that our understanding of Miri-Piri is not going to be monolithic. And I find myself having to remind myself of that. So I'm glad he added those points. I think the only other thing I'll say is, when you read the report out later today, you'll see that the questions that we ask based on context are different because different communities are in different places. And so the questions about, representation change depending on where we're looking at. And then we also are coming to conclusions about representation not being the ending point, but being the starting point. And so then what are the questions that we're asking ourselves once we're in those positions, like Harinder Singh has just said. So I think those are important points that I still have to remind myself of, that idea that our understandings are going to be different and how we choose to act upon those understandings are going to be different. Something we talked about when we were drafting the report was how caught up we get in left-right politics, how caught up we get in those labels, not just in North America, but all over. And I think something that I kind of learned as we were having these conversations is that our understandings of Miri-Piri doctrine are not going to fit neatly into those boxes. And like we saw in the period that we were talking about before, where people are making different alliances, it's just going to look different depending on how we understand the doctrine and what we understand as being the best move in a moment for us as individuals and sort of bunthically. One thing that I did want to talk about, going back to what I had said about the survey responses and engaging in other ways, is that we did explore examples of that. And so we did talk about the 92 Punjab elections and how the question there was about opting out and how that didn't really work out for us. And so we're looking at all these examples. And I think part of what I would encourage people to do, what I also need to do, really bring you back to that, is to continue to look at how we have tried to answer these questions in different ways throughout history and how that's going to keep happening. And if you can find an example that seemed to kind of work for people, and that seems to resonate with your understanding of Miri-Piri doctrine, then that's what we can go with. And something that we're seeing with the farmers movement and in the survey results is that engagement and our understanding of what it means to be politically engaged has expanded. And I think before we can we shouldn't ever, before we can ever have conversations about maybe what is more in line with the doctrine, we have to come to those understandings both individually and in smaller groups about what Miri-Piri doctrine is and how we've understood it both in like the distant past and in the recent past. So yeah, I think that's something that I'll remind people of, that I was reminded of through this conversation, which is that like it is not ever going to be a situation where we all think the same thing about politics and how to politically engage. It's about kind of moving beyond like labels, which we're really good at doing. We're really good at like rooting ourselves in labels, especially in like the Twitter age, but moving beyond those things and having larger, more nuanced conversations about how we understand the doctrine and then how we act in the world based on that understanding. So I know that that's not like we say this every time, but that's not the like clear-cut answer that people maybe are always looking for, of like, this is what you should do and this is what you should believe, because that's not how we've ever done it. And we see that in the Guru period too. So I think that's what I'll leave it with on that one.
Mm-hmm. To me, it sounds like what direction is the answer in, as opposed to like, this is the answer, which can be super difficult and like frustrating to not have that like clear-cut answer. But I keep going back to it, but like folks weren't 100% sure on like what the solution could be. So there's no way that like that answer could be provided. So nice and wrapped up in a box. It was really resonating with me from both of your answers, like how empathetic your stance was. I think that can be so hard, understanding why certain folks might understand Miri-Piri to be understood or defined or practiced in certain ways. So yes, a good reminder that we all have our understandings of like what is the correct answer, but yeah, meeting folks where they're at. So I guess, moving into the like, how do we practice Miri-Piri, or what that could look like? What is it that can help us assert Miri-Piri as it has been explained today, both individually and as parts of organizations? So I'm really reflecting. There's a question, I think, in the report that is framed around how do Sikhs navigate Sikh issues, Punjab issues, and in Indian issues without involving political leaders as the center of their struggles, without involving political leaders as the center of their struggles, but still to pressure the capital C center. So I'm wondering, how can Miri-Piri be used in those contexts, both individually and within organizations and institutions? Harinder Singh, we can start with you.
Sure. I mean, the only clear-cut answers Sikhs can collectively agree on, is that the clear answer comes from Gurbani, because that's what's not debatable. Everything else is debatable because we're dealing with imperfect systems, as we keep calling them now. So the today's hukum gives us one clear answer, where it says, Sab upar par Brahm Data. This is the hukum from Sri Harinder Sahib at Sri Amritsar. And from Darbar Sahib, it's saying Sab upar, like above all, because this is where the politics and the spirituality is. There are levels we have created. Instead of invoking those within us, which is what Guru has asked us to do, and Sikhs aspire to do, we have created the bosses, the hierarchies of these. And we are reminded, well, even if you're operating in that hierarchical system, even though sometimes you think you're in a circle, or even then there are hierarchies, even then just remember this, Sab upar, that above all is Par Brahm Datar, is the transcendent giver. And so what is that reminder for? The second line says, Teri take, Tera Aadhar. I rely on you. My support is you. So this understanding is the Sikh understanding, if I can call it the Sikh understanding, because that's what Guru Arjan Sahib is telling us today. If we operate with this as an individual, I'll just pick one example each. As an individual, I really need to figure out what Miri-Piri is as a doctrine. We really need to understand that our vocabulary is as entertained and described and articulated and enshrined in Guru Granth Sahib starts with Raj Jog, how to enjoy the spiritual and the political within you, as Guru Nanak did, and enjoy it perpetually. What does that mean? I think we need to delve into that. because the just the political and just the spiritual were not enjoying. They were looting people. They were putting things upside down, as it has been recorded. So that's the number one recommendation. How do I enjoy the Raj and Jog? If Guru Nanak is my model, and that's what he did on this earth, starting from his declaration, from his project called Punjab, but he took it global. In that time, he took it literally from Saudi Arabia to Sri Lanka and everything in between. So that's the number one recommendation, understanding Raj Jog nu manana kiਵੇਂ, how to enjoy the ability to decipher, to create the right policies while being in direct connection with the force of the world, Ekankar. And the first institutional recommendation I would say is, well, then the institutions really need to get into how to train people on this. Because personal understanding is very powerful, but to organize, you got to have these trainings. Our gurdwaras, our institutions cannot just be the Piri centers, you see. They never were. And since they've been reduced to that in the last 100 years or so, where I've been told growing up in Kansas City, Gurdwara which political gal nahi karni. Main kya fir masjid mein jaake karanga. This was my response. Like, where would I go wrong? Because that's what Guru taught in his Gurdwaras, in his Dharamsals. And that's what Sikhs have done. Whether it was the first Gurdwara in Stockton, California, or in the Khalsa Diwan Society in Vancouver, or whether it was in Medan in Indonesia, or anywhere throughout South Asia. That's what we did. So institutions need to really, really do their soul searching, their trustees and their boards, instead of spending everything to create personal legacies in the local cities. So you can say that I did this, I built this Gurdwara. The legacies need to shift towards how do we engage as collective, as the collective of Miri-Piri, the doctrine in the local politics of my community, in the state or the nation state national politics, as well as the Sikh politics, which is being manipulated from Akal Takht Sahab all the way to local Gurdwaras through their agents and through their alliances. So those are the two things. Personally, really delving into Raj Jog, and institutionally training people to nuance this to create an effective organized action to change the policies around us.
Mm-hmm. As you're speaking, it's also reminding me of the conversation that we were having at the beginning of this webinar around, can you serve the state and the Panth? Or are the two compatible? Can both be done? So it just seems like these are like questions. A question maybe that can be like transplanted and changed, of course, into different contexts. And I think even that we don't talk about politics in the Gurdwara, I think it's like a little bit naive, and that even that statement is already political. And I think like the political is already tied into that question. But Jasleen Kaur, I'll let you add on if there's anything that you wanted to share about the individual and institutional applications or engagings with Miri-Piri.
Yeah, the only thing that I'll add, and this is kind of based on like what I've seen people, how I've seen people frame kind of issues that we see as like outside of our own issues, because they're not Sikh issues, but maybe like, for example, in the discussion about like Palestine that was happening in May, I think we have a tendency to like kind of tunnel vision our issues, or have tunnel vision for only our issues, and we're not seeing kind of the larger systems at play or the larger relationships at play. And so I think something that we had put in the recommendation section as well is like, if you are principle centered in your politics, then it's not just about Sikh issues. Obviously, Sikh issues are important and should take, the front seat on how you engage with politics, but understanding how to like coalition build and how to build alliances, both institutionally and like as an individual, like, are you showing up for other causes outside of your own? I think that's important. And I think sometimes the conversation then becomes like, well, they didn't show up for us. And so for that, I will say, bring it to like Asakibar, like what does it mean to be a lover of the beloved? It does not involve transaction. And so this like expectation that we will only show up for other people if and when they show up for us, I think that is a thing that once you become more principle centered and more like rooted in what Miri-Piri doctrine is about, which is it's about ikonkar, like you will be able to involve yourself in that kind of allyship without constantly keeping score. And I think that like when we do that, it terrifies the state, no matter what state we're talking about, it terrifies them, because when we can understand our issues as interconnected, and we can organize to change things, I think we can't do it alone. So I would say that that's like a big thing, is being able to see our issues and what we would like to see changed within a larger sort of play, if I can use that word, and understanding how to build relationships with people where that principle centeredness is the thread that carries us through. Yeah, that's the only thing I'll add.
Great. I would also invite anyone joining us in our webinar today to share their questions that they might have in our chat box. I do see that we have a couple, so we'll get to those very soon. But yeah, if you have any questions, please do share them in the chat box. I guess before we delve into those questions, I will give my question primacy. I wanted to choose like a neutral word. So I'm interested in thinking more about borders and how, I guess, I'm trying to situate it within the Sikh context. So I'm thinking about borders and how this relates both to Sikh sovereignty and Miri-Piri, and that was kind of what was coming up for me, both because that's what I'm reading right now and as I was preparing for this webinar. And I don't want to delve like too much into the conversation around Sikh sovereignty because I'm mindful of today we are here and gathered to talk about Miri-Piri. And in that context, how does Miri-Piri inform our understandings of contemporary borders, or what some might refer to as border imperialism, and how does that influence our understandings of Sikh sovereignty? So I'm thinking about Miri-Piri as it impacts the creation of borders and how that impacts our understanding of Sikh sovereignty. I hope that was clear. And if it was, Harinder Singh, would you like to answer?
I mean, I can attempt to answer if I understood it right. But look, this question is very much in the context of post-20th century democracies in the world, because they started deciding, who carries the passport and where the boundaries of the nations lie and who can cross it, who can enter it, right? So in this context, I think Sardar Kapoor Singh has a solution which he presented. And he actually put it in this frame that in the democratic societies, what really is going on? And I think this is where there's a contradiction, he says, and every Sikh needs to deal with this. And what is that contradiction? That there is a collective action. Sikhs have a collective conviction, rather, and that collective conviction is now in contradiction to that the state is demanding allegiance. This is where the rubber meets the road, as we say, even today. We live in a particular nation state, and that state demands our allegiance. At the same time, we have a collective conviction of the Sikhs, which is what we are calling the Miri-Piri doctrine in this case. So he's saying, how do we deal with this? And he's acknowledging there are going to be frictions, and this is what we've been presenting. There will always be friction, whether you talk about the Palestinian issue as a US citizen, or whether you do it from the Indian perspective or Sikh perspective, regardless of your nation states, or whether you talk about what is happening in Punjab right now on the farmers' protest. So these frictions exist. We must acknowledge, and they will continue to exist. But if there is something which we can figure out, the solution we do have, and he says the solution lies in understanding and practicing the process of Miri-Piri. And he actually uses this phrase. He says, if it does not happen, if this contradiction is not getting solved, the problem is that the process we have adopted and the people we have picked to implement these processes, fault lies there. It is because of the process and the people we are not able to implement and solve this contradiction for ourselves. Now, he does say with a hope that if we are able to solve this contradiction, he's not going to solve it for us. Guru Gobind Singh or Guru Nanak Maharaj wasn't solving it for us. They were telling us how to solve it for ourselves. So he says, if we are able to solve this for ourselves, he says that state, whether it is deciding on the next border or whether it's giving our input on no one is illegal campaign, as it happens in Canada as well and other countries now, he says when the Sikhs are able to do that with the right process and the right people, then Sikhs will become the most invaluable assets of that state, because we have allowed Miri-Piri to change the realities, the policies as we call them today. He says, but if it does not happen, then there will be frustrated and suppressed Sikhs in every nation states, not just in India, including in America, Canada, and every other country we are living, 15 major diasporas. And when there are suppressed and frustrated Sikhs, regardless of which state they are in, there will be weakness in the strength of that nation. And we are seeing this, where our larger numbers or larger coalitions or movements have sprung up. And mostly we see this in the nation state of India, but we are beginning to see when there are movements, like I saw this in Myanmar. It's a country we generally don't think about, where the youngsters, the college students showed up on the street. And what is happening in Burma? They're very few in number. In fact, most of them are businessmen even. So their businesses are going to be jeopardized, but they decided to join their sons and daughters that as Burmese, it's important to go protest and show solidarity, whatever the military is doing in that country. So my point is, this Kapoor Singh's dictum from what he articulated 50 years ago is very important. It speaks directly to the democratic societies. Our role in those democratic societies is to solve this contradiction. And if we are able to solve, we can solve it if we adopt the right Miri-Piri process and we bring the right trained people to do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think what I'm thinking about, what I'm reflecting on is like the direction in which like that quote and the examples that you've shared can kind of, what direction those quotes and what you've shared can move us. So that's really helpful for me. Jasleen Kaur, I'm wondering if there's anything that you wanted to add around borders and SikhRI and
I won't say, I think I've sort of revealed my politics a little bit on this, but I will say that I've thought a lot about Harsha Walia's work and what she says about how borders function. And I think it comes back to this understanding of like the larger things at play. And I think that's part of our duty as people in the world, not just citizens under nation states, to understand how these things function. And if our principles that we are rooted in if we're rooted in Ikonkar, then like we have to understand the violence that certain systems sort of commits against people, not just our own people. I mean, because we have refugees coming from Punjab into the United States all the time, and I don't think that a lot of people maybe know that, depending on what bubbles they live in. But it's not just about us, and I think being able to educate ourselves about the things at play is part of our duty. And I think that starts to happen when we understand Miri-Piri doctrine a little bit better. I'll also say, and I know I said this to you like a couple nights ago, Manvinder, but I think a lot about Guru Nanak Sahib's like udasis and how absolutely just impossible that would have been to do in our current sort of configurations of nation states. And I think that's the thing worth sort of reminding ourselves of a little bit, that like interaction with other people and dialogue with other people is important to us historically. And to kind of like look at the way that fear has been kind of pushed in policy is another thing that's worth understanding, because our politics and our principles are not rooted in fear. So that's all I'll say about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that comment like kind of made me chuckle, because I think that's something that like I've heard lots of folks who I talk to who identify as Sikh. I've heard them like really emphasize the traveling and discovering, within SikhRI. So it's like, I think that was just like you would need a visa to go anywhere within like contemporary border formations. And I think it like obviously sounds funny, but it's also true. Like where are folks, where are they allowed, where are they not allowed, both literally and metaphorically. And even on your comment to fear, I think actually there's a question in the chat around fear. So maybe we could touch on that. Amrik shares perhaps that Sikhs have different interests, that Sikhs, we can be, can be in Amrik's experiences, are easily scared perhaps. And it is a scary thought to think about going against the state and not being, beloved by the state or helped by the state, because that makes sense. So how do we perhaps overcome that fear? And maybe I think this is a good space to think about both the recommendations from the report and maybe what that's looked like in your lives, understandings around overcoming fear or overcoming wanting to put Miri-Piri into practice. Harinder Singh, maybe we'll start with you.
Sure. So, the fear factor, let's bring that in, right? The fear is always present there. What's the antidote of fear in Gurbani? And the biggest model of that started with Guru Nanak Sahib for us. In fact, even that quote which I mentioned, Raj Jog Maneo, it says, what is in his heart? It says nirvair. So nirpau and nirvair come together. You will see this. The way you know the fear is gone, that the animosity is gone towards anyone, including a very corrupt state. You're going to fight that corrupt state, but you don't have that venomous attitudes toward the individuals who are representing the state. That's Guru Nanak for us. I know it's tough, but Sikhs have done it. Baba Banda Singh Bahadur did it in last 30th, and in fact, some of the people are even now doing it, but it's a rare phenomena. And this is why Sikhs, the Miri-Piri people who practice, is a rare phenomena, but we are working towards creating that conviction collectively. So the way to overcome fear in Gurbani is to become the embodiment of the fearless. And how you become that, this is where we work on our habits to be like a Kuankar. And we start with, working with this oneness paradigm, working with this Satnam idea that my identities, the temporary identities don't matter. The eternal identity matters, right? Which in the case of humanity is a more larger identity and a longer identity than Harinder Singh's in the particular locale, right? So that's what Gurbani says, that you work to become like the Kuankar. And the way you know it has happened is you will feel the grace. When you feel the grace, you know it has happened, because Nirpau is in the middle of it. And then it goes all the way to self-elimination. That's what we call Mool Mantar. So simple answer is, fear is big. You bet. Fear is very big everywhere. And yes, Guru Nanak did not need passports, but you know what? At his time, even within India now, if you want to go to Jagannath Puri temple, you will not be allowed. There were other hindrances. So the external manifestations keep changing. So I don't think you can say it was a better time. You ask any woman, they'll tell you, no, this is the best time. Right? So I think we cannot use just like the understanding of today to apply to the past. It was easier. Not really. I mean, can you even imagine anyone entering Kaaba and putting your feet towards the Kaaba today? So every situation is evolving. We have our own sets of challenges, because back then there were monarchical systems. Now we're dealing with post-Westminster style democracies in the world, and the post-democracy models are being looked upon. Our role is to look into those models. Some of us should be looking at what are those models from a Miri-Piri perspective. Some of us need to be looking at, if you're participating within a state, how do I change the game, or can I even change the game as to how the voter suppression is happening, even if I'm part of the Republican National Committee or party right now. Those are the nuanced conversation I think we need to get to. So the fear's antidote is love. In Gurbani, it happens when we invoke the Kuankar within, both the spiritual and the political together. It's a symbiotic relationship. And that allows us, we have the courage, we have the curiosity, and we have this healthy tension and controversies which we are able to take on them.
I think, I think that's a helpful context or questions and thoughts to move from. I thought that was going to be a hard question, so I kind of gave it a pause. But yeah, I think that fear factor, I think that was very helpful for my understanding. Jasleen, I'm wondering if you want to add anything.
No, I think, that was great. I will say that, I mean, we've all seen like videos coming out of the farmers movement and seeing, there's an element of fearlessness there. It doesn't mean that people aren't scared some of the time, but to do what people have been doing for the last year requires fearlessness, and that's not rooted in nothing. They're drawing upon Bani and history, and they're invoking it in their interviews. There's like 13-year-old kids invoking this stuff in their interviews because that is what fuels them. And so I think, Harinder already said it best, but like we have the tools to get to that place, and Bani gives them to us. And we know that that antidote is love. So we've seen it. It's possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I am mindful.
I actually want to make it a little bit more real. Not only is it possible, we increase the probability of it happening when we actually start invoking Miri-Piri within us. Mm-hmm. When enough of us do it, when several of us do it, and when that several doesn't mean half of Sikh population is doing it. It might even be only half a percentage of Sikh population doing it. It creates a remarkable shift in the thinking of those who want to accomplish and change the policies. Because and then there is an emotional outburst from the people who support all that. So that shift becomes, you take it to high probability of actually happening when enough of us do the mental and the spiritual and the emotional, and that politics is intertwined, what I call symbiotically, which means that for Sikhs, the spirituality does not exist without politics, and that politics does not exist without spirituality. They really are built in together. That's what Raj Yoga is. That's what Miri-Piri is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's just bringing back that like constant dialogue that Jasleen Kaur was also talking about, like how the two are like intimately tied. And I know we just spoke about this last year. So if folks are interested in hearing more about, I guess, what is Miri-Piri, which perhaps we haven't like fully explored, but maybe we have. If they're interested in more of that conversation, there is a webinar from last year where we do delve into that a little bit more. I am conscious of the time because I know it is Wednesday, the middle of a work day. So I appreciate everyone coming in and joining this conversation. I do have like one final question, and then if any others pop up, we're happy to answer those as well. I'm wondering how both of your understandings of Miri-Piri shifted after writing this report. And I know we've kind of touched upon these, but I'm wondering, if there's, any key nuggets, things you were thinking about, things that you now think about differently as a result of engaging with this work. Jasleen Kaur, we can start with you.
Yeah, I think I hinted at it a little earlier that like, I still have a lot to learn about how I understand this doctrine, because I am stubborn in my politics, and I think a lot of us are. But I think the biggest thing has been, or the biggest sort of like eye opener has been looking at how we've like always been wrestling with this understanding, or I guess how always wrestling with how to live out Miri-Piri and how we understand it. And that isn't new. And there's something kind of like reassuring about that, because it gets really easy to like look at our current moment and be like, oh my God, we've lost the plot. And it's like, well, no, we actually we've been struggling with this forever. And I also think like having tangible examples to go back to see how diverse that understanding has been in practice, is helpful in getting to a place where I'm not, shaming other people for things that I maybe don't agree with. And then I think one last thing is that it is reassuring to have a sort of a multifaceted understanding of what it means to be political in the world. Because I think, again, a thing that I hinted at earlier is that like there are a lot of people who are like very much jaded with the systems in place, but that doesn't mean we like turn our backs on what is going on and kind of like throw our hands in the air and let it go. And it's been really incredible to see people engaging in new ways, which, I mean, Harsha Wali has been an activist since before 2001, but people are engaging with our work now because we have to, and we're hungry for that kind of engagement. And that's really reassuring. And being able to sort of draft this and talk about this while watching the mass organization that's been happening with the farmers is it's just been very incredible, and feels very lucky to be able to have those things side by side. Yeah, that's all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's helpful to understand what your Miri-Piri, how it shifts, what it looks like, how that can change. Yeah, I think that's what I'm understanding from your comment, Harinder Singh. Wondering if there's anything you'd like to add.
While working on this report, I'm specifically one translation really hit me. I had read this multiple times, but I didn't really engage with it as much because this time I was translating it for the audience to see how to contextualize it. This whole 18th century description of how Khalsa actually is the organized form of Sikh. We all have our understanding of what religion is, what organized religion is. Well, the organized part in Sikhi is the Khalsa. And when Bhai Gurdas Singh was writing that, in the way he is written, we know the last line. We all sing it on Gurpurabs, on Vaisakhi, Vaho Vaho Gobind Singh, Ape Gurchela. That actually is the last line of that padi. It's a very long padi where he's describing that how the Khalsa got organized to take on this Meers and the Pirs, because they were utterly corrupt. And they did it at the time where it was almost impossible to do, because we talk like this, right? Is it possible? It was almost impossible to do because half of the Sikh population was killed in one day, and the 2/3 and these are the two Vadekalukaras. We don't have the resources. So this particular translation, very graphic one, which talks about what has happened, who really is the Bujdil, and who really are the corrupt, and who really are the ones who are creating the most amount of persecution. Within all that, it says, Tisar Panth Chalayan Vad Sur Gahela. So in this, I don't think we understand this mentorship which gurus were providing, and then creating the proteges to be the next leader. And this particular graphic description, as it got played out in very tumultuous time, in a very, you can say today we will say it was bloody, it was nasty. Well, we are seeing this in 2021 as well. Whether it is, Harsha Wali has been invoked twice. Yes, the same organization has demanded her resignation. And I remember engaging with her when it was early time in 15, 17 years ago. I would actually encourage, and I think our community is embracing her. But the same activists also need to understand and embrace Miri-Piri. Even if they don't personally do it, they must understand why Sikhs do. The Khalsa does what it does as well, because many of them fight this, including her. So it is not that we need to see eye to eye with the people we build alliances. We must understand why the Khalsa does what Khalsa does. That's what Miri-Piri is. Khalsa is the organized force. And if individuals are not able to organize because they're using a bad form of the process and really bad people to do it, that's a problem of process and people. It's not a problem of Miri-Piri. Miri-Piri may not make sense to many people, but as Sikhs, it makes a lot of sense to us. It is part of our psyche. And whether it is fighting with the Sikh Jathedars themselves, or fighting with the Gurdwara and SGPC elections, or the states or the nation states, the doctrine stands. It is us, individuals, who have to really become comfortable with it and then figure out how to organize with others in order to deliver not just for the Sikhs in Punjab or Sikhs anywhere in the world, but as Jasleen has been pointing out, the geographical realities are temporary measures, including for Sikhs and Khalsa. Our ultimate goal is to be able to see Miri-Piri as a tool to deliver justice everywhere, to deliver equity, not just equality everywhere.
Awesome. Thank you to you both. I think this conversation has, as always, left me with lots to think about. I don't think I've actually been thinking about Sikh issues or anything related to Sikhi for a long time. So it was nice to like prepare for this conversation and have this conversation, of course. I'm sure Jasleen and I will keep talking about it in the coming days. I would like, on behalf of SikhRI, I'd like to thank all of today's wonderful speakers for this insightful conversation. As always, a recording of this webinar will be available within 24 hours. And lastly, please tune in to the SikhCast, a podcast produced by SikhRI, where we explore the various issues and events affecting Sikhs worldwide. Thank you for joining in. Today's webinar will be ending now. Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh.
You are listening to SikhCast by Sikh Research Institute, illuminating every path.